Once again, welcome to the TheDasAcademy. This is the second class where we will be talking on the age of revival spanning from 1400 to 1550. So, we see that in this particular period that commences with the death of Geoffrey Chaucer, who had contributed to the history of English literature from 1343 to 1400. And since this age is beginning from 1400, it allows us to witness the death of Geoffrey Chaucer, although bringing in certain revivality, certain transformations, certain transitions that are coming across literary space. But we see that with the death of Geoffrey Chaucer in the year 1413, we see Henry V being crowned as the king to the English throne. And as we move towards the rule of Henry V, we see certain socio-political changes taking place. Gradually, Henry VI takes over the English throne, and we see two major rebellions coming up. So the first is the Cade's Rebellion, which is an uprising against the policies made by Henry VI that was led by Jack Cade, an Irishman. And then following we see that there is a War of Roses coming up spanning for 30 years. So 1445 to 85, we see a series of civil war that takes place between the two royal families. So the two royal families we are talking about here is the Yorks and the Lancasters. So the Yorks are referred as the White Rose and the Lancasters as the Red Rose. So we see that already we are circulating amidst this socio-political chaos and turbulence, right? We see that there is a disputed succession dating back to the overthrow of Richard II. We see there is a breakdown in the royal authority. Also, we see that there is a rise of large independent noble armies. So both the Cade's rebellion that was led by Jack Cade against Henry VI and the Wars of the Roses that took place in the form of a civil war between the two houses that are Yorks and Lancasters had actually taken a toll on the society on a larger scale, on the culture, tradition, improvement, progress. But apart from the socio-political atmosphere, we also see that on the literary front, there are certain group of people, or we can say prominent writers, who were coming up influenced by the contribution made by Geoffrey Chaucer. So we see that these Chaucerians can be divided into two segments. One is the Scottish, another is the English. And then we see the most important part of the revival age is that Thomas Watt and the Earl of Surrey is introducing what? They are introducing the sonnet with a beautiful metrical rhyme scheme that becomes very unique and significant in the period. And lastly, what do we see? That this age is closing with the development and establishment of three segments of plays. One is the mystery play, miracle play, and the morality play. So, apart from the turbulence, chaos, there is a revival in the space of literature. So, two dates so far we must remember 2 years, that is, first is the Cade's Rebellion in 1450, then is the 30 years of war ranging from 1455 to 85, that is the Wars of the Roses. Now moving forward to the literary periphery, we see that this age had undergone certain important events and actions. So we see that firstly, two important educational institutions coming up. The first is the Eton College in 1440 and then the King's College in Cambridge. Then we see that the writers who are succeeding this era have been highly influenced by the Greek culture study. So we see Erasmus coming up with his teachings of the Greeks that actually had improved and allowed a constant development of Greek studies in the age of revival writers. Succeedingly, we see the most important event, that is the establishment of the printing press by William Caxton. We all are aware of this name, very familiar. So, certainly, William Caxton's contribution in England and thereafter remains very kind of impringed on the English soil. So this 14th marks the 1476 as the important year of the revival. So in the 1476 we see there is a printing press coming up which was established by William Caxton. Gradually with the printing press being established we see publications, wide number of publications, and this is the time when actually Middle English, Midland dialects was kind of declining and English became a language of higher recognition and took a more modern form and structure. And lastly, what do we see? That there are certain development in the trading, in the merchant trading, the bourgeoisie class. So there is a constant development in the economy and employment coming up. Now shifting our discussion to the Chaucerians, we see that the English Chaucerians can be grouped together with Thomas Hoccleve, John Lydgate, John Skelton, Stephen Hawes, Alexander Barclay, George Ashby, Benedict Burr, Osborne Brockenham, George Ripley, Thomas Norton, and Henry Bradshaw. Now, what are they influenced by? What caught their kind of mind with the Chaucerian writings? We see that these particular English writers were highly kind of influenced by the diction, the form, the style of Chaucer. So certain examples we see is from Thomas Hoccleve's To the Knights of the Garter. We see John Lydgate's works like The Fall of Princes. Then we see Stephen Hawes's The Pastime of Pleasure. We see John Skelton's Boge of Courts. And we also see Alexander Barclay Castle of Labour, The Ship of Fools. So we see certain works coming up which were extremely important and highly kind of forming through the rhythm and style of Chaucer. So with these particular writers, we also see the Scottish Chaucerians who were in stark comparison to the English counterparts. So Scottish Chaucerians were basically a group of Scottish poets, you can say, which belong from the 15th, 16th centuries, whose work was highly indebted to Geoffrey Chaucer. So how did they differ from the English counterparts was basically in the tone, style and the subject matter. So we see James I of Scotland coming up with his King's Choir, Peblis to the play, Christus Kirk on the Green. We see Robert Henryson with the Testament of Cresside. We see William Dunbar's Lament for the Makers and certain other important works in the rhythm and tone of Chaucer. Now moving towards the poetical trends, which marks a very important part of the age of revival, are the pastoral element. So we probably see that this pastoral mode, this pastoral element became a very vital source for a satiric tone. So this pastoral mode was more of a vehicle that the writers used to satire the court, the urban life. And certainly in the eclogues, which were established by Alexander Barclay, we see that this pastoral mode theme was continually improved. Next we come is the influence of the allegorical structure laid by Chaucer. So we see allegories coming up from the Chaucerian works like the Book of the Duchess, the House of Fame, the Parliament of Fowls. Certain kind of similar tones and undertones and structure we can see in William Dunbar's work like The Golden Targe, Example of the Virtue, right? Example of the Virtue is written not by Dunbar but by Stephen Hawes. And then we move on to certain narrative ballads, uh, right? So, and lastly, we see the most important element, that is the satire, which was approached didactically. So we see Alexander Barclay's Ship of Fools, which is a kind of is a satire, which has this ironical tone. Then we see John Skelton's Boge of Court, which is also very satirical. So certainly, until now, we see that this period was under constant revival, transition, right? And then gradually, with all the influences that were taking place, we see the two most important sonneteers. So, who they were? They were Thomas Watt and the Earl of Surrey. Now, these sonneteers, what did they do? They kind of formed a very definite rhyme scheme and have had a very small, you can say, these sonnets are basically of 14 lines, as we know. So they, in these 14 lines, they were formed and given a structure along with a very kind of a very unique kind of quatrain coming up. So this was an experiment which kind of laid a greater impact on Shakespeare as well. So apart from Thomas Watt and Earl of Surrey, we will be coming up with the Shakespearean sonnets in the further classes. So what do we see? The Thomas Watt is experiment with the stanza forms, with the 14 lines of sonnets, coming up with the terza rima, ottava rima, satire, quatrain, rhyme scheme that together formed this beautiful structure called the sonnet. That was much carried by Henry Howard or the Earl of Surrey. Next, we see that there are certain prose writers coming up in the age of revival. They are Reginald Peacock, Sir John Fortesque, we see William Caxton, we see Sir Thomas Malory, Hugh Latimer, John Fisher, who profoundly had a very literary and linguistic importance throughout. Other writers that we already have heard about are Thomas Wilson, John Capdevitt, Robert Fabian, right? And then we see Thomas More coming up with his important work or an educational epitome in the age of revival called the Utopia. So, Thomas More is writing Utopia in the 1516. So, why did it become so famous? Because it was a book of satire that was criticizing Europe's political corruption and religious hypocrisy. So, we see that this Utopia are divided into two parts. So, the first book or the first part serves as an introduction and also a commentary on the second, and the second particular part, you can say, or the book is actually claiming to establish an ideal human society. And the narrator of this Utopia is Raphael Hithlode. So the main features of society at Utopia are elimination of private property, universal labor, moderated pleasure, and family as a microcosm of the state. So this particular book becomes the very perfect embodiment of humanist rational ideas. Gradually we will be ending the age of revival with not only the embodiment of and the influence of Utopia, but also William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament of the Bible into English. And lastly, we see Miles Coverdale becoming the prime English translator of the Bible. So certainly this age was coming up with so many different forms, so many different influences, so many different transitions, that it gave a very nice shape to the 16th century. Then we see that the mystery plays coming up, miracle plays coming up, morality plays coming up. What are these plays? So mystery plays are basically certain dramatized stories from the Bible, like the story of the fall of Lucifer, the nativity, Noah, Cain and Abel. And as we know that they are not just taken from the Bible and dramatized in its own style, but also they were performed on the Corpus Christi Day. Secondly, we come up with the miracle plays, which becomes the representations of lives of certain different saints of the time. So what did they do is that, they took up the stories, the influences, the lives of these miraculous interventions of the saints. And they were formed and grouped together in a structure of play, like the conversion of St. Paul, Mary Magdalene, the play of the Sacrament, and others. Now, what is the morality play? The morality play is actually evolving from a sermon, from the lessons that were given up in the church courts. So we see that it has a rhythm of allegory, it has certain moral undertones, it deals with salvation, it deals with confrontation, and all the more the approach is very didactic. So we can see that the very purpose of this morality play and its establishment was didactic, and it attempts to instruct the audience on the application of Christian doctrine to the everyday life, actions, events, activities, and nurture the inner individual skill, capability, virtue, and cultivation. One of the primary morality play coming up in 1425 is the Castle of Perseverance. With this morality play, we are introduced with the interludes, and some of the important dramatists of the Age of Revival are Henry Medwall, John Bale, John Raston, and with that we see that the Age of Revival becomes a very significant authorial power in the socio-political front, but also takes over the literary sphere with influential works by the Chaucerian scholars, writers. So we see that English as a language is assumed to its modern form, the printing press established, then we see education and other ideas are being caught up with the Renaissance. We see Scottish and English Chaucerians becoming the prime commemorates, and also we see certain sonnets, dramas, plays taking a wonderful form. So with that, we have a rough idea, a brief outline on the Age of Revival. So I hope you liked the class. So for those who wants to add some important information, ideas, please comment down below. And for those who are looking for some important resources and has some doubts, please mail at the address that is given in the description box. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.